Hello there, welcome to the Saroy channel, wherever you are in the world, and so much love to each and every one of you. How are you doing? I hope you're doing remarkably well. And you know the rules, go and spoil yourself, get yourself a lovely effervescent glass of something to drink or a lovely warm cup of cocoa, because we're part 2 of our story tonight. So if you haven't heard part 1, click on the description because you don't want to miss out on the first part of the story. And let's continue with part 2 of our story. When Sonia was a little girl, her mother had dumped her off on her father, claiming she wasn't cut out to be a mother, and that had been that. Sonia didn't know who her mother was, and certainly had no desire in finding a woman who had about as much interest in knowing her daughter as Tinkle, her dog, would have in a bowl of salad. Sonia could not wait to see her father again. He'd get the surprise of his life, to see them fortuitously arrive at his cabin unannounced, but he would be thrilled to see them all. As they drove ever forward through the tenebrous night, Sonia noticed there were many more cars on the interstate at this late time than she would have anticipated. Maybe many people over the Easter holiday weekend were driving to the mountains for a break, and had thought driving at night would be a more efficient way to get there. It made perfect sense. Sonia certainly believed driving at night was a great idea, especially when you were carrying kids in the back of your truck. They were out of action at this time, and would not be tirelessly complaining of how bored they were, as they would be asleep for most of the journey, and that was a big plus. Jocelyn had drifted off to sleep in the passenger side seat. Her head began to flop against the window like a rag doll, banging against it gently, making a tapping sound, while a slight snore emanated from the back of her throat. She was definitely fast asleep. The weather had suddenly turned. If it was daytime, the clouds would have become as grey as gunmetal, but at night it was like the darkness was wearing another tenebrous coat, as a mist enveloped the black night in a foggy haze, blocking out the faint sliver of moonlight and obscuring all the stars. It would seem that all the scenery tonight had become so ambiguous. It was covered in sheets of darkness, like the inky black dust covers over your patio furniture, so you couldn't see a single thing. All of a sudden the heavens opened, and the audacious rain that knew no sense of moderation began to pelt down in a frenzied chaos, with the feistiness of a full-on garden hose. This is all I need, thought Sonia, leaning forward in her driver's seat, trying to see the road more clearly, as her windscreen wipers vigorously tried to wipe away the pounding rain. But it was a challenging thing to have to do. A tenacious fog continued to crawl across the road, hoovering up the moonlight, which meant that there was nothing to see at all, apart from her headlights that lit up the road. She knew she was driving in unfavourable, uncongenial weather, but Sonia had driven through far worse. She could get through this in the way she'd overcome all the other obstacles and challenges in her life. Sonia was a natural-born fighter, and wasn't easily intimidated or subdued. She had driven on roads covered in black ice many times before with her father, so this trip was a doddle by comparison. The vigorous, interminable downpour was so loud, Sonia was remarkably surprised that no one in her truck was waking up from the noise it evoked, for the rain was not reticent, nor was it quiet. Everyone seemed locked in a very deep sleep. Several trucks had passed her speedily down this plunging mountainous descent, going so fast it seemed ridiculously short-sighted of them. What is wrong with people, thought Sonia. Why would they drive past me so fast in precarious conditions like this? The windy road that meandered down the mountain in sweeping curls had become a death trap, dangerous, slippery, exceedingly treacherous, and was easily inviting an accident to happen if you weren't paying close attention and taking extreme care and caution. She appreciated the unrelenting rainfall was not to be trifled with, that had made the road unstable and unsafe. Sonia sagaciously perceived she needed to drive with the skill of an advanced driver, but she maintained a safe speed, keeping her sharp, discerning eyes glued on the road, refusing to be distracted. She was wide awake now, paying extreme attention, as one wrong move, and she could be heading for great trouble. She didn't like driving on such hazardous roads like this, with all her children in the back of the truck, as this road rudely welcomed so many unexpected sharp turns, sheer edges, and awkward bends that dipped down the mountain. In truth, she had no comprehension of knowing what lay in front of her, especially when facing a dicey, unpredictable obstacle course like this, when most of her visibility had been snatched up by the hostile demands of an uncooperative night and the unmerciful weather that looked unlikely to ever abate. This was all right for one of those online video games, but this was real life, and this road presented a great challenge, even in good weather. She gritted her teeth and held on to the steering wheel so tight that the whites of her knuckles began to show. She could hear her father's encouraging voice in her head saying, "No big deal, Sonia. You know you can do this. You've got it, girl." For a moment the rain pelted down, and then out of the ethereal curtain of mist a haunting silhouette appeared in front of the road. "What the hell is that?" thought Sonia, peering forwards in her spattered windscreen to get a better view. "What the hell is that?" She pressed down her brakes forcefully as her truck came to a grinding halt. Suffice to say, if she hadn't stopped in time, she could easily have driven into this huge, ambiguous figure. But she couldn't make out who or what it was. It was so indeterminate. She wasn't sure what she'd just seen. Sonia reluctantly opened the door of her truck to see what was going on. She reached towards her dashboard to retrieve a torch and climbed out of her truck, moving towards the strange cryptic figure, shrouded by mist. "Hello," she calls out. "Is anybody there?" She flickers her torch onto the large figure standing there and does a double take. She can't believe what she's actually seeing. The creature that obscured her path was in fact a Bigfoot. There was no doubt about that in her mind. It seemed to squint under the protuberant light of her torch, clearly not appreciating its impertinent glare. Sonia realizes it has got to be over 8 foot tall and about 700 pounds, with very large shoulders, covered in long dark black hair that is soaked to the skin. Sonia had heard about Bigfoots before, even listened to documentaries about them, and heard that they might live in the forests of Washington state. She did remember her father telling her he'd encountered a Bigfoot before on one of his long-distance truck trips on which she was in attendance, but she had never got to see the creature. In this close-up encounter with the illustrious creature known as Bigfoot, let's just say this bizarre experience was more than a little overwhelming for Sonia. Her stomach was churning, her heart pounding violently in her chest, as beads of perspiration broke out between her shoulder blades and trickled down her back, along with the rain. For a moment Sonia was terrified. She remained glued to the spot, her legs feeling like cement blocks beneath her, her mouth opened so wide in the sheer wonder of this unlikely event that seemed so surreal. Suffice to say, in this ponderous creature's presence, she suddenly felt quite tiny. The Bigfoot was powerful, lofty, majestic, built as robustly as an army tank. Yet despite the Bigfoot's intimidating size and his powerfully masculine energy, there was a benevolence about him which invited a calmness to wash over her, tranquilizing her frayed nerves and reassuring her primal instincts, which would likely have told her to run away as fast as her legs could possibly carry her. Sonia was surprised by how human the creature appeared. His face was handsome, in a rather rugged way, with a very powerful masculine jawline, chiseled cheekbones, a prominent forehead, a flat aquatic nose, and leathery grey skin. For a second the creature's deep-set dark eyes held her gaze. It spoke to her in a language that Sonia had never ever heard before, but it was translated almost immediately into her head. "Opati, hipota bogoba, imbasipofona, hosafi." It pointed down the curvaceous bend of the mountainous road. "Very bad accident down there," he said. "Lots of cars. You keep yourself safe. Imata pisa, homo pikaka." The creature turned around and glided away gracefully down the hilly embankment and was gone from Sonia's sight. Sonia stood in the middle of the road, flabbergasted by the strange encounter. She was oblivious to the rain that was beating down in her body in sheets. Did that really happen? Did that really happen? She pondered. She heard 2 other trucks stopping behind her truck. A man with an umbrella got out of his truck, hurrying towards Sonia, with a frown on his face. "What's going on here?" he asked. "Why are you blocking the road?" Sonia, who was now soaked to the skin, looked up at the man incredulously. "We had to stop," she said. "There's a dreadful accident further down the mountain road. Lots of cars, I believe. I think it might be a pile-up." The man looked bewildered. He opened and closed his mouth, unable to say anything. Moments later they heard the sound of ambulance sirens and police vehicles hurrying towards them. "Bloody hell, I think you're right," said the man. "Something's happened. How did you bloody know? Are you psychic or something?" Sonia nodded. "Something like that," she said, knowing that the truth would sound incongruously bizarre and fictitious, but she knew what had just happened was real, and the revelation whipped inside her with a spirited excitement, like an unbridled wind sweeping up over the Atlantic. "I guess I should be thanking you, love, rather than giving you a hard time. We better get back into our trucks out of the way for the ambulance to get past. I can't believe there's so many trucks on the road tonight. Never seen it so busy before. I'm driving to the mountains with my family. I thought driving at night would be a great idea, but this road is treacherous, and I can't see a bloody thing. You're soaking, love. You better get back to your truck. It's raining cats and dogs out here. Some people tonight are driving like complete idiots." Sonia really was drenched to the skin. Her clothes clung to her like wet rags. She looked like she'd dived into her swimming pool with all her clothes on, but she didn't care. She suddenly felt deliriously happy as she climbed back into her seat next to Jocelyn, who was now wide awake after she'd heard the sounds of the ambulances, and even her children had their noses pressed to their windows, wondering what was going on, while Tinkle began to yap at the rain. "What the hell is going on?" asked Jocelyn. "Why are there ambulances and police? Has there been an accident?" "Yes, I think so. Some kind of accident down there on the mountain road." They were to discover that there had been a multiple pile-up further down the mountainous road, as she had expected, where 3 people had lost their lives so tragically, and 7 had been rushed to hospital. The trucks that had gathered behind Sonia had all come over to her to thank her for stopping. Little did they know that it wasn't Sonia that they needed to thank, but a Bigfoot. Jocelyn had stared at Sonia with a bemused look on her face as she tried to make sense about what had happened. "I don't get it. I mean, how did you know that you needed to stop?" Sonia looked at Jocelyn with a broad smile on her face. "It might have just been an angelic intervention, that's all," she said. Sonia knew that the Bigfoot she'd encountered had certainly saved her family's life, or at least prevented them from being severely injured or caught up in a multiple pile-up. Before they resumed their journey, Jocelyn went to the trunk to retrieve a towel from her suitcase for Sonia. "Use this. You're drenched to the skin." "Thanks," said Sonia, grabbing the towel and drying herself down. Then they proceeded along their way, as a policeman with a flag was guiding the trucks past the pile-up on the road by waving them around a very narrow corner, where there was just enough space to get by. Sonia had refused to look at the carnage. It made her stomach churn as she saw the buckled cars in the road that looked like they'd been crushed at the knacker's yard. It was hard to believe that anyone had got out of any of those cars alive. "That could have been us," she whispered to herself. The rain had stopped. There were policemen bustling around the area. The people that had been involved in the accident had possibly all been ferried to hospital, but Sonia could smell the coppery scent of blood in the air and see pools of it in the asphalt road. She shuddered in horror. Jocelyn could only be heard saying, "My God! My God! We could have been caught up in that! We could be dead, Mrs. Asher, if you hadn't stopped! I'm so glad you stopped!" Don't think about it, said Sonia kindly, reaching out to squeeze Jocelyn's knee. We're alive and well. Isn't that what matters? When Sonia did arrive at the cabin, her anger towards her husband had dissipated, and so had the sheets of rain that had stopped for quite a while. All she could think about was how lucky she was to be alive and well, and her children all in one piece. She also considered the Bigfoot she'd encountered, and she couldn't wait to share the extraordinary account of that evening with her father. She wanted to tell him about the incredulous Bigfoot she had seen walking out of the mist in front of her truck. He had told her he'd encountered a Bigfoot while driving his long-haul truck. She had forgotten all about it. Now she wanted to be reminded about the event all over again. She knew what had happened tonight was incredibly special, and felt so privileged to have met the elusive, idiosyncratic creature called Bigfoot. It must have been 4:30 in the morning when they arrived at her father's cabin, an hour and a half later than she had planned, due to the unfortunate delays, thanks to the Pileup on the road. Both her children were still fast asleep in the back. They'd only woken up briefly when they'd heard the ambulance sirens blaring past them. But when the riveting drama had waned and receded, and their curiosity had died down, they'd both fallen back to sleep. Sonia's truck had wobbled precariously down the rocky, uneven road, through the sprawling countryside, towards her father's cabin, but they still remained fast asleep. It remained dark, there was no more rain, and the foggy mist had evaporated, so the moonlight that brushed against the countryside illuminated the path clearly. So when Sonia parked her truck outside the cabin, her father must have heard her approach. His cabin door flung open. She could see him in his blue dressing gown, dashing towards the truck, with a large smile on his face. He looked bewildered, but extremely pleased to see them, as if he couldn't quite understand what Sonia was doing at his cabin so early in the morning. But he guessed she had a good reason for being there, and doubtless he would hear about it very soon. Sonia could feel the tears welling up in her eyes, as she hastily bounded towards her father, throwing her arms around him happily. She sobbed into his shoulders, saturating his dressing gown with her warm tears. For a moment, Sonia and her father were locked in a firm embrace. He patted her back gently. "Whatever it is, sweetheart, I'm sure it's going to be all right. You know it always is." Sonia adored her father more than anybody else in the entire world. He was her rock. He ruffled his hand through her slightly damp hair affectionately. "Whatever is the matter, sweetheart? I want to hear all about it." "Everything's the matter, Dad. Everything." "Well, let's get the kids tucked up into bed, shall we? And then you can tell me all about it. First of all, I might suggest you change your clothes. You feel rather damp." The children grumbled and moaned as Jocelyn guided them out of the truck, directing them to their bedrooms in the cabin. She then found herself a bed in one of the spare rooms and told Sonia she was going to sleep. "See you in the morning, Mrs. Asher. Have a good night's sleep," she whispered. Sonia's father, whose nickname was Elk, was a big stocky man with large shoulders and a masculine jawline. When he had been a long-haul truck driver, he'd carried an excess amount of weight around his middle, but after he retired and became more active, his body had become lean and strong. Her father's face was weathered from having sat behind the steering wheel of his truck for many years, having been cruelly exposed to the grueling effects of way too much ultraviolet light that is not exactly kind to the skin. She watched her father prepare hot chocolate over his gas hob and bringing her over a warm mug as he sat down opposite her. "Well, what is all this about?" he asked her, putting down a hot cup of cocoa in front of her, which she sipped gratefully, appreciating the warm liquid gliding down her throat and lining her now empty stomach. "Dad, I don't know where to start." "Try the very beginning, sweetheart. That's always the best place as far as I'm concerned." "Well, me and Luton, we had the Richardsons over for a barbecue today. They're good friends of ours whom we met through our own children. It was such a lovely day, Dad. Everything couldn't have gone better. The weather was fantastic. The food was delicious. Jocelyn helped me prepare salads. She's very good with the children as well. She was amazing with them all. Once the Richardsons had left, she came into the kitchen sobbing. She told me that Luton had groped her and tried to kiss her." The tears spilled down Sonia's cheeks like a deluge of raindrops. Her sympathetic father hands her a tissue, which she accepts gratefully. Thanks, Dad. I just don't understand why Luton would do this to me, to us, to our marriage, to our children. Why would he throw everything away just for a quick thumble with our nanny? It makes no sense to me at all. And Jocelyn is so young, Dad. She's only 20 years old. Elk looks at his daughter nonplussed. His forehead furrows into hundreds of puzzle lines.
Usually when something doesn't make sense, it's because it's not true. I don't understand. Luton is not a womanizer. It's out of his character for him to behave like this. I've known your husband for many years before you even married him. Are you sure, sweetheart, you haven't got your wires crossed somewhere down the line? I mean, with the greatest of respect, that nanny of yours is barely past being a teenager. What is a 40-year-old man going to have in common with a teeny bopper like her? The girl is just 20, as you were saying.
Well, what do you mean, Dad?
Well, did you speak to Luton about this?
How could I? I was furious. I got my children together and I came here at once.
You mean you didn't even have it out with Luton? Ask him what the hell was going on? Why he would grope the nanny?
Sonia looked at her father through her bleary tears. Well, what exactly are you saying, Dad?
I'm not being funny, sweetheart. But you seem to be pointing an accusatory finger at Luton, without hearing his side of the story. Now that's hardly fair if you ask me. You're immediately assuming what the nanny has told you is true. How do you know she's not making it all up? Young people can get over-emotional, you know. Take things out of context or exaggerate.
Well, why would she make up something like this? I can't see why she would do that.
Elk sighs. Well, something's not adding up here. As I keep telling you, I've known your husband for years. I also know teenagers well enough. They aren't always reliable. Maybe Luton said something to her. She made those allegations up to get her back on him. Luton loves the bones of you. He wouldn't jeopardize his relationship with you, for goodness sake, over a nanny in your employ. In the morning you need to phone him, sort this all out, find out what's really going on here. I think you'll find you're barking up the wrong tree.
Sonia realizes what her father is saying is making perfect sense. She needs to give Luton the benefit of the doubt, rather than just jumping to conclusions. He had never once lied to her about anything. Why would he start now? Dad, there's one more thing I need to tell you.
Yes? What is it? Says her father, raising a brow.
We nearly had a bad accident tonight. Well, at least I think we nearly did.
What?
Said her father, his face growing ashen with concern.
What the hell happened?
There was a multiple pileup down a mountainous descent. You couldn't see anything, Dad. It was dark. The road was slippery. Everything was blanketed by a thick, foggy mist. And worse still, it was bucketing down so fiercely with rain that my windscreen wipers were struggling to wash it away. I was amazed the amount of trucks driving on the road over the Easter weekend. It was busy. I think people had decided to tackle the long journey to the mountains at night, to enjoy an extended Easter break. Everyone seemed to have the same idea in mind. I thought the roads would be empty, but I couldn't have been more wrong. I've never known it this busy in the late hours. Anyway, some trucks went whizzing past me at an audacious speed in the abysmal weather. I knew that wasn't a good sign. Dad, I don't understand why some people drive like lunatics in bad weather, especially when visibility is poor. I don't know what possesses them. It's like asking for trouble, like climbing into a tiger's den when the tiger is hungry, or swimming with piranhas with a big bleeding gash on your arm. It's just as silly. All of a sudden, in this pouring rain, I stop my truck because I see this huge silhouette standing in the middle of the road, Dad, moving through this curtain of mist. I climbed out of my truck. I wanted to see what was going on. I had to stop. Elk looks at his daughter as if she's lost leave of her senses.
You got out of your truck, he says, his jaw tightening, because you see a huge figure standing in the mist.
Yes, I did. There was no moonlight. Everything was obscure. I couldn't see what this thing was. It was a Bigfoot, Dad. He spoke to me. He actually spoke to me. I'm not kidding. But not in your normal conventional way as you would expect. In my head. It was telepathic communication. He was scary at first because he was so huge. In the beginning, I was rather frightened. In truth, Dad, I felt like an ant next to him. But he was so kind to me. I can't explain his eyes to you. They were almost angelic. Anyway, when he spoke to me in my head, he told me there'd been an accident further down the road with lots and lots of cars. He told me to keep safe, and then he was gone. I knew that what he told me was true. He seemed all-knowing, very wise. You know what I mean? Almost like he was an angel sent from God himself.
Well, he may well have saved your life, I have to say, Sonia. By the sounds of things, you could have ended up being part of that dreadful Pileup. Goodness gracious, what a relief you're all safe and well.
Dad, remember you told me you encountered a Bigfoot once on one of your long-haul trips? I think I was with you, wasn't I? What happened there? Please tell me.
Elk's incredulous story. Very well, says Elk. I'll tell you. Where to begin, though? I was driving my large truck at night, as I thought I'd make better progress when the roads were less busy. I had an order to deliver, and an irate customer at the other end of the line, complaining bitterly that the order should have been delivered a week prior. He was never an agreeable client at the best of times, and most of the truckers had bad experiences with him. So nobody wanted to make that delivery, but in the end I agreed to do it. More's the fool me. You had come with me on this trip instead of staying at your grandmother's house. You were lying fast asleep on the passenger side seat with your teddy bear in your arms, and our cat Missy, who travelled with us wherever we went. Do you remember you were the one that found little Missy? I think you were 8 years old at the time. We had made a truck stop, a year earlier I think it was, at a gas station, and you had gone to the ladies and returned with this frightened little kitten in your arms. You had found it lying curled up to a dead kitten by the dumpster. You came up to me, your eyes brimming with tears. "Daddy, look what I found," you said. You were so sad about the kitten, because it was barely alive, your eyes round and pleading. So I couldn't resist you. I promised that we'd keep the kitten for a couple of days. We would nurse it better, then take it to a shelter. We did take it to a vet for some meds. He told us the kitten would have died if we hadn't rescued it. By day 2, that kitten was purring and eating well, and seemed to enjoy the truck, so we kept him for a little longer, and then we couldn't part with her. The rest is history, of course. I think we must have had that cat for over 20 years. It was a good innings for a cat, I have to say. It never had a sick day in its life after that, until the day it didn't wake up. Best way to go, if you ask me, in your sleep.
I remember, said Sonia happily. Missy was the best tracker cat ever. She was so affectionate, and she enjoyed travelling. She would jump out of the truck when we stopped off at various destinations to do her business. She'd return to the truck like clockwork. She always came to us when you whistled like a dog. It was incredible. Elk removes the large Cuban cigar from his cellophane packaging and lights it up, popping it into his mouth and blowing out a big puff of smoke. Sonia loved to watch the smoke billowing out of his mouth in a long white stream, and rather enjoyed the aromatic smell. Her father always told her that smoking tobacco rarely relaxed him.
I can't believe I'm smoking a cigar. And look at it, 5 o'clock in the morning. There's a first time for everything, I guess. Well, I remember I was a little nervous about seeing Mr. Pickling. The last time I'd made a huge delivery to him, he jumped down my throat, screaming all kinds of obscenities at me. I was in the front line of his abuse every time I saw him, even though I wasn't the guilty party. It was the supplier at the other end that was at fault, that held up the deliveries. I was wondering what kind of reception I would be receiving the following morning. I was driving steadily through the night. I was drinking copious amounts of coffee along my route to stay awake. I had to pull over to answer a call of nature, and I was never one of those truckers that was happy to pee in a bottle, unless of course it was highly necessary, but especially not in front of a young girl like you, even if you were fast asleep. I climbed out of my truck and moved over the guardrail, down a slightly hilly embankment, towards a gathering of trees. It was a quintessential opportunity for me to stretch my legs. I hated sitting in one position for far too long. It would give me the most dreadful cramps, and especially the area between my shoulder blades would get stiff and tight. For me, stopping for a pee was this opportunity to do some jumping jacks and a few light stretches. I told you I'd be a couple of minutes and asked you if you wanted to relieve yourself as well, but you said no, so I locked you in the truck. Missy didn't hesitate to follow me out of the truck. She always enjoyed an opportunity to stretch her legs as well. I dashed towards an oak tree to relieve myself. I could smell pine from the pine forests, as well as wild flowers and moss infusing the air, with their very pleasing bouquets. The night was filled with the sounds of crickets and frogs, and the moonlight was quite bright on this evening. It was a fabulously beautiful night. I do remember that. I did my business and a few jumping jacks, but when I whistled for Missy, she didn't come at once. So I scanned the meadow for any signs of her with my flashlight, and then there she was by a tree, looking at a great big huge lump lying on the ground, what looked like an undulating hill of some kind. But whatever it was, she wasn't impressed by it. Her tail was thrashing wildly, and she was paying absolutely no attention to my calls and my whistles, but staring at this thing. When I wandered over to her side, Missy was making a growling sound at the back of her throat, her eyes fixed on what I had first thought was a little hillock of some kind. But as I moved closer, I realized it was a dead bear lying on the ground in a fetal position. I was certainly sure it was dead, so I tapped it with the end of my boot, just to make absolutely sure. God only knows why I did this. I think it was a knee-jerk reaction of mine to check if the huge bundle of hair lying there was dead or not. This thing suddenly moved, gave me the shock of my life. It sat up, then raised itself onto its feet. I felt like David standing before Goliath, as this creature was enormous. I knew at once it was a Bigfoot. I was terrified. The thing was standing yards away from me, and the moonlight lit the creature up so brightly. Missy was hissing at it, jumping on my shoulders, her ears back, her eyes terrified. The Bigfoot actually rubbed his eyes, as if he thought I might be part of a strange dream he was having. I stood there gawking at him. I don't know who was more bewildered, me or the Bigfoot. Neither of us had anticipated such an unlikely encounter. I wanted to run with every part of my being, but I couldn't do it. It was like I was frozen to the spot. My heart began thundering in my chest. My mind was screaming, "Run! For goodness sake, run!" But the Bigfoot stood there. He scratched his head. His eyes locked into mine. And in that moment, I knew he was never going to hurt me. I saw his eyes were emotionally intelligent. He looked clever, and kind even. His face was remarkably human. He was about 9 foot tall, exceedingly burly, with powerful muscles. I remember I naturally spoke to him, because it seemed like the most natural thing for me to do. So I apologized to him. I said, "I'm very sorry. I didn't mean to wake you up." I think his humanness meant it felt natural for me to talk to him like that. He looked at me and nodded. I heard the words in my head. "I certainly didn't expect to see you either." He then gave me a nod and glided into the trees, and he was gone like that. That was the momentous moment for me, when not only did I realize that Bigfoot was real, but the creature had spoken to me, which is why I believe that Bigfoot spoke to you tonight.
"Why do you think he was lying there?" asked Sonia.
I'm not sure. He was probably taking a kip under the stars. I can't actually blame him. It was a magnificent night. I'd have done the same if I wasn't driving that truck. I think we really surprised him walking over to him like that. He didn't hear Missy, though. He was so sound asleep. It was Missy who first encountered him, not me. That cat never did miss a trick, did she? Sharp as a razor she was. Listen to that. I hear a truck moving towards my cabin. I suspect we have a visitor. Now, why am I not surprised? I suspected as much. I bet I know who it is, he said, smiling at Sonia. I'll make myself scarce. You have a lot of talking to do, I can see. Sonia did hear the truck rolling up outside the cabin, and the engine switching off. Moments later the cabin door was flung open, as Luton stood there in the doorway. Sonia wanted to run over to him, throw herself into his arms. She was so pleased to see him. But then she reminded herself that Jocelyn had informed her that he had groped her, so the anger began to rise up in her belly again. She stood her ground like a lofty tree in the woodgrove, waiting to see what her husband had to say. "Thank God you're all right," said her husband, rushing up to Sonia, throwing his arms around her. "There was a multiple pile-up on one of the mountain roads. 3 people dead, 7 seriously injured. I don't to God know what I would have done if anything happened to you and the kids." We're fine, absolutely fine." "What the hell is going on?" says Luton. "I knew I would find you here at your father's cabin. I got your very peculiar message. What has Jocelyn been feeding you?" "She told me you groped her and tried to kiss her. I mean, how could you do this to me, Luton? To our children, to our marriage? I hope she was worth it." Luton frowned. "You believe our nanny over me? That's rich, Sonia. Do you really have so little faith in our marriage? Even if I was that way inclined, which I'm not, I would be incredibly stupid to have a grope with a nanny under our roof, risk losing you and the kids. But you know me. Surely you know me better than that. I'd never cheat on you. I haven't got it in me. I've got way too much to lose, and I love you far too much to hurt even a tiny hair on your little head. But then why would Jocelyn make all this stuff up? I don't understand." "Well, later in the afternoon she came up to me in the backyard. I hasten to say she was the one that tried to kiss me, not the other way round." "She what?" "She tried to kiss me. I told her she was young enough to be my daughter, and while she was a very attractive young girl, that I was a happily married man who was almost twice her age. She burst into tears, stormed off belligerently. She was most upset with me, but I thought she would get over it. I've always known she's had a bit of a crush on me." Jocelyn was standing in the doorway. "Is this true, Jocelyn? Did you try and kiss my husband? Did you make everything up?" Jocelyn hung her head in shame. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Asher. I don't know what I was thinking. Your husband's telling you the truth. He did nothing wrong. I tried to kiss him, but I promise I won't ever do it again. I promise." To cut a long story short, Mrs. Asher forgave Jocelyn, and the young girl continued to work for the family. But she knew a line had been drawn in the sand, so she never flirted with Sonia's husband again. Sonia could have sacked the young girl, but she thought better of it, deciding that we all can make screw-ups from time to time. So she gave Jocelyn a second chance and never regretted it. So there you are. That's my story. Wow, what an incredible story. Until next time, goodbye and good night.